Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may happen to be. Welcome to the UCLA Getty Conservation Program's Distinguished Lecture Series. I'm Darnell Hunt, Dean of Social Sciences here at UCLA. UCLA's longstanding partnership with the Getty has only strengthened the program through a shared mission of community, engagement, and education. That shared mission adheres to our motto in the social sciences: engaging LA, changing the world. The UCLA Getty Conservation Program continues to be a leader in not only advancing the preservation of cultural heritage materials, but in expanding access to the field of conservation by offering training, workshops, and mentorships to underrepresented populations. We are honored today to have Dr. Gabrielle Tayac, Associate Professor of Public History, George Mason University, and former curator at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. It is now my pleasure to introduce the chair of the UCLA Getty Conservation Program, Professor Lynn Wharton.
Thank you for the introduction, Darnell. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that as a land-grant institution, UCLA and the UCLA Getty Conservation Program acknowledge the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of the Tovangar, the Los Angeles Basin, and the South Channel Islands. Los Angeles has the largest population of Native American and indigenous people of any city in the US, and multiple programs at the university now engage with members of the Gabrielino Tongva tribe to share knowledge and work to address the decimation of the Tongva population in the 19th century. Funded by the NEH, our program is developing a new initiative to deepen our collaborative work with representatives of tribal collections. I'm very happy to welcome everybody to another event in our Distinguished Lecture Series. At last count, we had almost 1,600 RSVPs for this lecture, so it's probably a good idea that I can't see you all. Given the size of the audience, we won't be able to interact with live questions or even through chat. Instead, Dr. Tayac and I will have a discussion following her lecture. Some of you sent questions in advance, and I'll attempt to introduce them into our discussion. Before I introduce Dr. Tayac, I'd like to just say a word about our program. The UCLA Getty Conservation Program is the only conservation program in the Western United States and the only program in the country that focuses on archaeological and indigenous materials. We offer MA and PhD degrees in the study and conservation of cultural heritage materials, and our primary values include diversity, collaboration with representatives of cultures associated with the objects in our care, and sustainability. Our intention with this series is to highlight how cultural heritage conservation engages with larger social and political issues. Speakers in the series address narratives associated with cultural materials and traditional practices of care. The title of Dr. Gabrielle Tayac's lecture today is Ancestors Speaking: Objects and Cultural Sovereignty in Native America. Dr. Tayac, a member of the Piscataway Indian Nation, is an activist scholar committed to empowering indigenous perspectives. She earned her PhD and MA in sociology from Harvard University and her BS in social work and American Indian Studies from Cornell University. Her scholarly research focuses on hemispheric American Indian identity, multiracialism, indigenous religious and social movements, while maintaining a regional specialization in the Chesapeake Bay. Dr. Tayac served on the Smithsonian's National Museum of American Indian staff for 18 years as the museum's first education director, and then as a historian and curator. She engages deeply in community relationships and public discourse with audiences from kindergarten to the Obama White House. She recently returned from a 2-year journey to uplift the voices of indigenous elder women and leaders and help them preserve their treasured cultural legacies, sponsored by Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. Gabby is now an associate professor of public history at George Mason University. With that, I welcome Dr. Tayac to our Zoom stage.
Well, greetings and many thanks to you, Dr. Wharton and Dean Hunt, with respect to especially to our pathways as sociologists going in different but also convergent directions. I'd like to give a sincere greeting to our Tongva relatives and also to Dr. Mishwana Gomin and the extended family at the American Indian Studies Research Center. A warm hello also to those of you who are tuning in, who have dedicated your energies and lives to the ongoing protection and regeneration, or shall we say, rematriation of Indigenous knowledge and action. So I begin from my tide waters to yours. And let me turn up the screen and thank you for also indulging the multiple boards that we have here and self-done engineering. Here we go. All right. So what I hope to channel for you as what I understand to be a pretty vast and diverse audience today is a fundamental ethic to guide your practice and approach as conservators, curators, stewards, and also those of you today who are knowledge carriers here yourselves, people who are here just to learn and experience some of the understandings that we can share together in this forum. I hope that this conversation will lend all of you more support. And the concept that I would like to bring forward, I think can best be described as relationality. More simply said, family. As you may have heard in the acknowledgements given, there are kinship terms used, and putting kinship and connection at the center brings our attention to a shift away from work towards a product and more towards a relationship, a process, as the scholar Jackie Rand speaks of in a very helpful and important compendium called Stewards of the Sacred that was edited by a late great ally, Dr. Marty Sullivan. We're talking about a web of the whole, in which the tangible material, the cultural heritage, or the touchable manifestations imbued with life and family, simply sometimes known as object, is an essential part. We're talking here about the touch of ancestors. As Suzanne Harjo, a matriarch leader, says, these manifested materials help us to touch the hand, who touch the hand for generations backwards to the present and to the future. It's a spiral of time, as you can see, faded in the back of my slides. And I'm going to brighten up this fade as we go along. I'll take you through a journey. It's going to be a bit quick to the ways that these essential relationships and families in the Indigenous world were assaulted and separated, traumatized. And we'll also be giving thanks to the ones who held on long enough and persisted in their insistence to be in that moment of change, to take that moment and make the connection between the ancestors and those of us here going towards the future. So it is like a spiral, like these shells, because every phase that I speak about today is still in motion and that work is never done. So from my tidewater to yours, I take you to the east where I start, learning first from family, as many of us do, and responding to an intergenerational call to take on this life's work. Here at the center of the slide is what has been called a stolen spirit, a mascot found just across the river from present-day Washington, D.C., a place that is my homeland that extends from the Washington, D.C. area up to what we call the fall line in the rapids, and then all the way down the Potomac River to the Chesapeake Bay. I show this face in the center based on a decision to allow testimony to come through, and photos like this show collections that are taken without permission, throughout both of the areas of our Piscataway people who still deal with erasure attempts today, and it also is shown in every single landscape. To the right of my slide is my grandfather, who was an herb doctor, a traditional herbal medicinal practitioner, and also an activist who came out of the backwoods and swamps further down in Maryland, in the steamy forests of our homelands. The people who stayed and had been converted to Catholicism in 1640 and still lived within the confines of an original reservation that was set up as everybody else filled in. And as slavery and enslavement came in and settler colonialism came in, our community actually stayed and blended in. And like the word that is our tribal name, which is Piscataway, which means where the waters blend, we brought things into us both voluntarily and involuntarily, and that's who we are now. What you see is a photograph of a turkey, who's named for the wild turkey, laying on the ground above his ancestors. He's laying above an area called Moyon, which is, and this is probably about 1977. And he's feeling and taking in and absorbing with a smile what they have to say to him. And at that time, as you can see to the left, that had been many decades into a period of incredible rupture where ancestors, human remains, objects were just ripped out of the ground all throughout the Chesapeake, and actually all throughout the United States and all throughout the Western Hemisphere were experiencing these kinds of removals. On the left, you can see Turkey in front of a stone with a carved face. Some people thought it was a face of George Washington. It could also, though, very well have been the mask face, the living face, the spirit face that marked the entry to our territory on Piscataway Creek. He had gone there on a weekend with two members of the Bureau of American Ethnology, all the way to the very side with his face kind of cut off and glasses, we believe is T. Dale Stewart, who was really a forensic physical anthropologist, a bones and skulls man who was part of the taking of our ancestors from the ground. But at the time, our people really were so isolated that often they found that the only people interested in culture were the very people who were taking it away. So this is really getting to a sense of the calling that we've found over the generations of people who have responded to see how do we recover, who are we now, how do we stop the exploitation, and then how do we transform and grow into something that's new and better, and that's centered within our own scope. So how did all of this erasure start? And I want to take you back to the idea that actually from the Chesapeake, it's really quite amazing that there are hardly any surviving contact era, or I would say invasion era objects that survive today. All of these from our area, our region, are in Europe. And when I say ethnographic or cultural heritage, it means that it's material that wasn't taken from out of the ground with archaeological investigation or excavation, but rather materials that were made at the time. So what you see here is what I would say is the first mode of extraction. And that's what we call the cabinet of curiosity, the spoils of empire. I called this slide, "The Empire is Curious and Curiouser," referring to this idea. It's both curious, wanting to, explore, take back, show the wonders of the world and the reach of the imperial. from apparently unknown and often described as savage and strange places. So these cabinets of curiosity, as those of you who know from as conservators, are really the first types of museums. These are private collections, sometimes made more public, and it shows like everywhere the light touches of the king or the queen, and how that these materials that were taken from in situ were taken completely out of context and composed into these kind of almost wonderful spaces. Now, this particular one, what you can see in the middle is a piece called Powhatan's Mantle, and Powhatan's Mantle is an extraordinary piece. It comes from the Powhatan, or the Pamunkey, the Powhatan peoples that were on the Virginia side, who were in contact with the English from the time of John Smith around 1607 and even before. And of course are the people that are most associated with the famously known Pocahontas or Matoaga or Rebecca Rolfe Manute. This piece is, it's very 2D here, but it is quite luminous and extraordinary. And somehow or the other, this mantle, Powhatan's Mantle, ended up in a place called Tradescant's Ark, or the Museum Tradescantium in Oxford by July of 1638. So who got this? How did it get there? It's believed that it was brought in by this figure on the left, John Tradescant the Elder. And who was John Tradescant the Elder? Well, as is first described, he was the father of John Tradescant the Younger, but he also was a person who was sent to collect things to bring back to London, usually botany samples and other kinds of materials that showed, you know, the strangeness, the apparent strangeness of the world. And he bequeathed his collection to the Ark. He also received quite a bit of the library of Captain John Smith, who was the person who came to invade Jamestown, the people that never tactually left. So when he came back into London with this material, he then, John Tradescant the Elder, became the keeper of His Majesty's gardens to King Charles I. And I just want to say I love these titles. Like, why don't we have job descriptions like this? So, but more seriously, this is how so many of our ancestors were carried away, carried across the water, where they linger in spaces. Some of them, we don't even know what happened to them. They were so devalued. And I have to say that when I've been looking at these cabinets of curiosities, you know, at first I was very angry at them, and I still am, but it's very interesting in the sense that these are objects that were taken at a time when there was no expectation that the peoples that they came from would disappear. They would be subjugated, but they would remain intact. We also have another phase of museums. We want to fast forward quite a lot. So if you think about this, before we're looking at about 1638. I'm going to take you forward 200 to 250 years to the late 19th century, the 1800s. And so, you know, it's definitely for sure that we Atlantic world indigenes have been through it all, every phase, as have many of our relatives in California in what was known at one point as New Spain. And so we can see this next big phase of removal of culture, of life, of family invested in objects, of people being extracted, and at this point for salvage and for study. What you can see in the photo here is George High, who is the man in the bowler hat, next to two Zuni people, and then I believe it's his wife all the way on the side. George High was a collector whose collection who ended up becoming the collection that would be known as the Museum of the American Indian, which then was transferred into the National Museum of the American Indian, which I'll speak about in a moment. But I would like to also let you know more about this time period and bring you to the year that Smithsonian started. That was in 1846. So think about this. That's just 7 years after the last massive and murderous Trail of Tears, which was the Cherokees' enforced removal from their homes in the Southeast, who were just one tribe of so many, just one nation of so many, who was ripped out of their homelands. It's also just 3 years before the genocidal unleashing of death in California, which is one of the most well-documented genocides in the hemisphere. What we also have moving a bit forward now is the establishment of the Bureau of American Ethnology in 1879, which also became located at the Smithsonian. And this time period coincided exactly with the year that a man named General Richard Pratt established the Carlisle Indian School, who had the motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man." So think about this. Think about what this time period was. And at this point, for salvage of what was being considered to be people who could not withstand the onslaught of a superior civilization, Native people, their materials were ransacked by the hundreds of thousands, by the millions. The little boy on the side is a little boy named Minnick, who came to be known as Minnick Wallace. And Minnick Wallace came with a group that was sent to the American Museum of Natural History, and ended up with a group of Greenland, with his family, who were indigenous people from Greenland. And he was the sole survivor of this group. Some had gone back, but others died, including his father, of tuberculosis. So he became a ward of the superintendent of the museum. And when his father died, they didn't tell him that what they did in the museum was take his father's body, and this is graphic for a second, boiled his father's body down for the skeletal remains to study, and then staged a mock funeral so that Minnick would think that his father was buried. This little boy never really fit into the society that he lived in, another human exhibit. He went briefly back to Greenland and then returned to the US and died in the Spanish flu epidemic in 1918. So what we see here is, it's a blend of the actual sinister and then the intent to study. And so what we have with what became the High Foundation is a collection that started about 1897. One man, George Gustav High, who eventually amassed thousands upon thousands of objects for the intent of study. I want to also frame the time period more about what was going on, and again, what is seen as a separation of ancestors, object, family, people, language, lives, land. It's all very much connected. That in 1901, in his address to Congress, President Theodore Roosevelt said that the intent of the Allotment Act at the time, this was the policy, was to create a great pulverizing engine to break up the tribal mass. So we have a pulverization of tribe, of person, of object, of, again, incredible isolation. And where do we go from that? Through this all, it's very clear the very fact that we're having this conversation today is that it is incredibly hard to erase a people. It's incredibly hard to erase and destroy a family's need, want, and desire in unending attempts to come back together. And this is where we can touch on this notion of cultural sovereignty. So what we see, often we frame in loss and stealing of death, and all of that is there. And in that context, what we also see is an incredible drive for life. And it's almost, and really what you can see here in this photo are Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois, more frequently known as Iroquois, but actually more frequently known as Haudenosaunee, an incredible confederation of nations that now is along New York and what's known as New York and Canadian border, walking with their wampum belts. And wampum is made out of two kinds of shell beads. The purple of the quahog, which is a clam shell, and the white of a whelk spiral shell. And coming from this living, breathing source of Mother Earth energy, really imbued with animation and life, they're woven into testaments, encoded entire libraries in shell, churches, cathedrals, governments, social codes are all woven into this, and they need the activation of a living voice and breath and system that is incredibly complex and still survives and transforms and grows to this day. So this is where we get to the sense of an enduring and persistent notion of cultural sovereignty. So what is sovereignty? For American Indian and Alaska Native tribes and villages in the US, there is a legal and constitutional definition of sovereignty, a nation-to-nation relationship between those who are federally recognized and the United States government. It's one of the levels of government. So that's very important and key to keep in mind, especially when you're looking at laws and legislation. I'd like to talk more though about the notion of inherent, ancestral, persistent sovereignty on its own, the capacity for people to self-govern in every sense, not just self-determine. The idea that you don't need to have US law in order to be sovereign and indigenous. There is also United Nations definitions of this, the ways of relating to environment, the notion that Native peoples have the right and capacity to maintain their own pace of life, their own worldview, and actually to reestablish relationships with their objects that they have never ceded and not given up rights to. So going from rupture to repair is a really important concept, and it's encoded quite astonishingly beautifully in what's called the two-row. You can see in the middle, there's a two-row or Goswenta wampum that shows two purple paths on a white river of life. And those two have to do with, it was a canoe and a Dutch ship side by side. It's said to come from 1613, but it really establishes this notion of sovereignty, of going down the river of life, but never disrupting each other and being together on the same path. So that's the hold on, centuries and centuries, so that we can have the conversation that we're having now in the movements. So the movements of Indigenous people for self-determination and sovereignty over time really gained force in the 1970s. And along with gaining ground for self-determination, treaty rights and policies, meaning to improve health, well-being, land rights, religious rights. It's incredible to think, but American Indian religious freedom was not guaranteed in a nation state that was supposedly founded on one of the principles of religious freedom, not until 1978, and that law still does not have in total enforceability and in any sense of the term. So when we're looking at a sovereign context, we have still, with all of these issues, Native peoples, Indigenous peoples, and Native America, with all of the social issues and health things, health disparities going on, the violence that people live with. Up front and center along with that is an ongoing claim and work to reclaim their lost relatives who were invested in objects. And so with that movement, really when you see the National Museum of the American Indian that's in the middle of this image, and I've also wanted to acknowledge and celebrate and thank a number of leaders and thinkers that have really formed my life. Dr. Richard West, who was our founding director and also for many years was out your way at the Autry. Suzanne Harjo, an incredible matriarch of change. Inés Talamantes, my late great teacher, who really taught about the whole. Dr. Charlotte Heth, who got me to the museum in the first place and is one of your own from UCLA Cherokee ethnomusicologist, and of course, the great Vine Deloria, one of the greatest intellectuals of the 20th century and 21st century. So these people never gave up. And as a result of that movement, managed to work with many other people who I don't have here, most notably Senator Daniel Inouye, also late and great, to form the National Museum of the American Indian in 1989 through an act of Congress, and the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. I would really also encourage you to look at another one of UCLA's own, a wonderful, wonderful project, so important, the Carry Our Ancestors Home project that really focuses on repatriation, an incredible resource. So, you know, this is really, oh, and George Horse Capture. I'm sorry, I don't have all my, I can't see my entire screen. Wanted to mention George Horse Capture, also very notable and important elder who carried these intentions from the occupation of Alcatraz to the opening of NMAI and beyond. So grateful to him. So, you know, really it's one of these times, it was really a galvanizing moment to enforce an ethic and a law, a legislation that would mean that institutions who had held our ancestors, all of the materials that were separated, that then there is a process and a process in a way of, as it's so well put by the Tongva and American Indian Studies partners and the other partners at UCLA, the idea of carrying our ancestors home. And so this building, NMAI, is right in front of the Capitol, right at the seat, and also reinstituting landscape, voice, connection. And I walked through the door thanks to Charlotte Heth in 1999. 4 days after graduating as a sociologist, I thought, oh, I'll see what's going on here, but also feeling that I was not going to participate in a museum project that was part of the extraction. But when I saw that it's more about the relationship, that's when I agreed to stay, and then I was there for 18 years. What you see at NMAI even today, and what's been developing, is a multifaceted work that is also part of it's a huge place, right? At the seat of the center of the United States capital city. But it also reflects in many ways so many other museums, tribal museums, archives, libraries, museums. I would really point you to an organization called ATALM that led to the formation. So in a way, NMAI is not the start, but a culmination of a moment as we pivot going forward. So, you know, what happens when families come back together? After spending all those years at NMAI and working with partnered exhibits with communities, not only for the support of those communities, but also very much to go outward to a worldwide public. NMAI is one of the most requested places for cultural ministries, people working in conservation, people working in curation, education from around the world. So its impact is huge about how do large nation states also work with representing and partnering with minority and indigenous communities within their borders, marginalized people. So, you know, after all this time, I started to think about, so what does it look like when we go from not just the outside into the community, but the community out? And I came to the museum because it was a community restorative enterprise, and my role was to facilitate that connection. And that partnership was valuable, but I think maybe not only as a sociologist, but somebody who came to this work specifically really as a more of an active enterprise, I was really longing to see what more could happen. What happens when you curate and you conserve and you work with people, not for an institution that's an outside institution wanting to partner, but from the center of the knowledge keeper themselves? What happens then? What happens when you can put resources there and center the resource on the knowledge keeper? And this is where I had the opportunity to work with a program called Spirit Aligned Leadership Program, which is a program sponsored by Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. And I spent 2 years working with as a personal curator for 8 Indigenous elder women wisdom keepers. I'm going to show 2 of them today. I'd like to shine some light on them and thank them. Of the many of the other 8 that I work with who are just absolutely precious and wonderful, and I would recommend that you take a look at the website to learn more about them. So what happens when there's no strings attached, when we widen the practice? So I had the chance to work with Professor Yvonne Dupuy-Peterson, who's Chehalis from the Northwest Coast, Washington State. Her name also is Tunimus. They send a person. She's a master basket weaver and inheritor of her mother's lineage, who's shown to the left in the late Hazel Pete. Yvonne is here in the middle and also to the right, standing in her beautiful, beautiful forest. She's also a political scientist that's trained by Vine Deloria and a professor at Evergreen. And she said to me something really interesting. She said, you know, baskets have to live in families, and the older ones teach the younger ones, and that not everyone learns the same weave. And that way, everybody matters. Like, you need everyone. You need everyone to produce a whole. And then they also weave together their environment, from the grasses, from the mud flats to the tree, which she calls the teachings of the tree people. And you have to learn in a sit beside kind of way. So we spent time in multiple places in her homeland, and the culmination of my time working most intensively with Yvonne was getting the chance to welcome her into DC, where she came with her daughter to look at the collections that are at National Museum of the American Indian, and look at weaves that had, because of missionization, removal, boarding schools, violence, assimilation issues, people having to leave their homelands, had not been done anymore. And so she was able to go with these baskets, and this is what I want to show with conservators, that she was able to go with the baskets and spend time with them. And this is the kind of work that NMAI's conservation and collections teams and material specialists work on every day for years. And so rather than being at the museum, having people come in, and again, I'm not a material culture specialist, but coming from the outside, when I was on the inside with people coming in and supporting, working on curation of exhibits, this time it was working with the elder to support her, move her at her request to see these, and then see what she did with them on her own terms, and what she was able to create with her family and her apprentices and her networks. So it's really quite an extraordinary experience to be with somebody like that. Another person that I wanted to bring your attention to is the most wonderful Dr. Henrietta Mann, who's also known as Prayer Cloth Woman. She is Southern Cheyenne, and works with, really is somebody, again, who has had a hand, who touched the hand. She was born in 1934, and you can see that's her in the little cradle board in the black and white photo with her great grandmother, whose name was White Buffalo Woman in Oklahoma. Her grandmother, her great grandmother actually, was a person who had survived the massacres at the Washita. So this is little baby Henry in Oklahoma in 1934, being raised and presented and loved and taught and spoken to and breathed into by her great grandmother. And this, again, imbued her, like she herself was taken as in the directions at her birth and presented in the format and with sacred pipes and stones and stories and language, and had gone on to, and is still so vibrantly working towards curating her own collections, deciding what she wanted to keep, how she wanted to move it. Did she want to bring it into an institution or not? And this is her talking to, there's a new First Americans Museum, which is going to open in Oklahoma. That's her all the way to the left in her storage locker, which we went through, amazingly beautifully organized, and her favorite location up in the mountains of Montana, very beautiful, tranquil space. So this is somebody who I would say, you know, again, like the others, how do they keep knowledge for what I would call a sovereign generation, the generation of now, the generation we have, and the generation that's coming. Just a couple minutes to wrap up, looking at what's the point and what's the work of those of you who are working in conservation. What does it mean? And I'd like to refer you to one of my favorite quotes of all time that was coined by my colleague, my Hopi colleague, also a sociologist, named Dr. Angela Gonzalez, who said, being Indian is not being part something, it's being part of something. So I see really, you know, the roles of conservators are being part of that story too, of how to bring families together, how to store, protect, and then also make sure that there is access and life connected to these materials with the people who love them. What you can see in the spiral building, that's the top of the Cultural Resources Center in Suitland. It's the collections facility of of National Museum of the American Indian, along with a real shout out to the conservation team who train people through the Mellon program and through other programs, are always welcoming and working with Native people and Native communities to bring life and maintain life and connection to the objects. There's a really interesting example of that is, you can see in the American Indian magazine, where there's a Wayot dress that was conserved and returned for ceremony to the community. I'd also like to point out to you the ways that this is working within Native institutions like Pechanga. I had a chance to travel to Pechanga and see their cultural center, their conservation work that's done in-house on their own terms for their own people primarily and within their environment. So that's an idea of relationship and reciprocity, and to keep that ethic of how do you, like, think about it as how do you support a family? How do you support family? So just bringing you back, I did get a chance years ago, and I hope to go again to visit Powhatan's mantle. And coming off of the 3-dimension and looking at the luminosity of the spirals, each one the size of my hand, kept in the case that's there. You know, wondering, is Powhatan's mantle, is it material that, is it a speaker? Is it an ancestor that speaks to the world? Is it an ancestor that speaks from home? And that's a question. And meeting with the conservation people, again, fabulous names that they have, like the Keeper of Antiquities. I'm like, that's a really cool title. Seeing how to take care of this now very fragile piece, the only piece, the only spoken form embedded in 4 deer skins with the marginella shells, each one so bright, so illuminating and moving, that as I saw it, I was texting back to women, Indigenous women and friends in Virginia, in North Carolina. I'm like, I'm here, I'm looking at it, and I'm crying and they're crying. And they were saying, repatriate, repatriate. And then one says, no, rematriate, rematriate. And so, you know, those are the kinds of decisions that need to be made between, you know, from the Indigenous communities. And basically as conservators, you're keeping it, you're keeping these materials safe for that time. So just ending with this powerful ancestor, that's the golden oak at Pechanga, that sits just caretaking and living and breathing with the community, with the objects that are returned and the ones that are learning. So with that, I'll close and say it's been a joy to spend this time with you, and we can take some questions.
Gabby, thank you so much for such an enlightening presentation on ancestor speaking, objects and cultural sovereignty in Native America. I have to say that your analysis as a sociologist, combined with your experiences within the museum and within communities, provided such a rich understanding of how cultural sovereignty plays out in Native practices and on the care and knowledge transmission. It was really interesting for me to hear the perspectives of elders with working with cultural materials and keeping knowledge alive outside of the museum, because my professional experience has been inside of the museum. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that. To step back, you know, the field of conservation as it developed in the West was really built on this assumption that we can understand cultural materials through material analysis. So we're trained as material scientists with the ability to identify materials, fabrication methods, we can date, and we physically preserve the collections in our care. And yet our field has really dramatically changed in recent years with the recognition that community members have ongoing relationships with objects within museum collections. So these more collaborative practices are being developed and in museums. So I'd love to just pivot to the museum context a little bit and hear you speak a little bit more about your experience at the National Museum of American Indian, perhaps working with conservators. I don't know if you have any stories or maybe just discuss the kinds of programs that you are seeing developed.
Yeah, that's a great question. And thanks for that question. I mean, it's really, conservators are part of every team, every part of work practically that's done with communities, not just for programs and research coming out of communities, but one thing that I'm thinking about is we had a really interesting canoe that we were looking at that's a Lenape canoe, and wondering if that, a Delaware canoe, wondering if that canoe was also made out of the same tree that is known as the canoe making tree, or the tulip poplar in the Lenape language. So, you know, working towards trying to figure out what material is this, and does it correspond to the language that the people took with them in their removals out to Oklahoma or not. So that's one example. Another example was where we had another visit, and this is more of a ceremonial object, so I'm not going to describe it too much, but it was really that the person that was coming to see it from the tribe that they were coming from felt that the material was overly separated, and so it needed to be put back together, which was really important. Of, like, you know, and that's more of a collections question of how to put these materials together in a way that works. The other thing is, going to conservation more specifically, is what are the levels of possibility of how much something is brightened or not, how much is it stabilized, so that it can either be sent or shown. That's another piece that really comes into play with conservation. So I think one thing I want to mention is that NMAI does have something called the Traditional Care Program. So what I've seen with, I mean, again, our conservation team was always really, probably in many ways, one of the ones that had the most interaction sometimes with communities, along with collections of people coming in wanting to reunite with their material, with their objects and things.
Yeah, thank you for that. You know, one of the comments that you made while working with the elder who is a master basket maker, she mentioned that baskets have to live in families. That just really struck me. And how would that translate to the museum context?
Yeah, so that often has to do with how are you organizing your material. The idea that there are ways that when communities come into collections and they see that there are certain ones that should be grouped together in a particular way, think about that versus another category that you might have had that's maybe an older category or one that seems more efficient. Work on how to maintain that relationship. So putting families of baskets together versus separating them out, or if there's a bundle of material that belongs together to try to keep it together. It was really interesting seeing the difference between, even for NMAI, between NMAI and Pechanga, for example. So that with Pechanga, there was much less of an interest or worry about having people handle the objects. And again, that had to do more with the fact that it was tribal members who could come in and pick them up. So, you know, not the same kind of issue gloves necessarily, not as sterile, allowing people to touch it. And I know that sometimes that also has to do with toxics that might be left on material that's older and preserved. But just allowing much more interaction. If there is something that needs to come outside to breathe or be in ceremony, let it be outside and breathe in ceremony in a way. This notion that there's the balance between the conservation and the life of the object, and then also seeing what is meaningful and what are your priorities with how that material resides. I think you find out a lot more information working with communities too. It benefits the field.
Absolutely. And, as I mentioned at the beginning, we just received this NEH grant, which we're very excited about, to help us further develop collaborative relationships with tribal collections and other collections having to do with African American culture and history and Asian and Latinx. With this notion of collaborating, where maybe students might be working on materials from these collections, but we would work with community members to better understand their significance and also receive guidelines on cleaning, as you mentioned, or repair or special storage needs, for instance. So we're very excited about this. I wanted to just bring in a question from a member of the audience, conservator Anya Dani. This is very specific. She says many conservators, as well as the American Institute for Conservation, are located in the DC metropolitan area. And she wonders, how might the conservation community around DC use their training and resources to help support the Piscataway Indian Nation and other indigenous communities in the area in ways that are meaningful to these communities? How might DC area indigenous communities be approached respectfully and not in a way that's burdensome to give, how stressed people are in the current pandemic and economic crisis? Could you give some guidelines here?
Yeah, and I'll give guidelines also just, more specifically, but also more generally. That's a really important question, the fact that you asked that, and it shows how much the fields have grown. The idea of what can conservators do to support the communities, right? What can you do to support the communities by asking them, and of course not stressing them, because sometimes the communities are large and sometimes they're small and not everybody has a what they call historic preservation officer, especially little ones like Tonga and Piscataway, which are connected to large metro areas, and we're not that big. So I do think that by making those offers, you can reach out to the tribes more specifically, or if there's material, there's objects, cultural heritage materials that are in your collection that you see, to invite people to come and view them. The other piece might be, people have things in their homes, and that was something that your last, highly distinguished speaker, Dr. Spencer Crew, mentioned. The idea that people have material in their homes and they don't always know how to keep them, so maybe helping with materials, or in cultural centers. Many of our family's materials and others that I've seen, they're in a drawer, they're in a box. Is there a way to help people put things together in a way that it's protected and stored? So having that kind of exchange, I think, would be really, really helpful too.
Yeah, that just reminds me of how much work we have to do on all fronts, all of us. And I think, conservators need to learn a whole lot from community members who hold knowledge, traditional knowledge. And I would like to think that our material knowledge also can be shared, and that these collaborations can end up being fruitful, for all, and really help us care for collections in more appropriate ways than we have in the past. So it's 12 o'clock. I hate to say it, but it's been an hour and it's been amazing. You're just, So wonderful, Gabby. Thank you so much.
Wonderful to see you. Thank you for letting me go through, it's like 10,000 years and 45 minutes, 400 years of it, but really wonderful to speak with you. And please, people can get contact information and be in touch, and definitely be in touch with resources at NMAI and other institutions and communities around you. I really appreciate the time with you.
Well, thank you. And for those of you that weren't able to hear this whole presentation or would like to hear it again, within a few days, it will be up on our website. So with that, thank you, Gabby. What a wonderful, wonderful presentation.
Thank you for having me in person sometime. See you then.
Goodbye to all.
Bye.